Anyone can replicate the lifelike appearance of a truck when building an RC model, but what about the frustration and monotony of repairing that vehicle? Here's everything I learned replacing the steering servo in a 1/25th scale GMC General. Hello everyone and welcome! Today I've got the 1977 GMC General back on the bench, a custom RC project that I covered in detail on this channel, which utilizes one of our new CTC01 chassis. This here is designed to help transform just about any one of the numerous 1/24th and 1/25th scale semi-truck plastic model kits available from manufacturers such as AMT and Revell into fully functional RC vehicles. Combining some easy to 3D print plastic parts we've posted on our Patreon with one of the convenient hardware kits available from our website or from the store tab here on YouTube, you'll be well on your way to having a nice base for your own custom project. If you want to learn more, check out the video playlist I've linked below in the description. While a lot of effort has gone into making this chassis as easy to 3D print and assemble as possible, every project is an opportunity to learn something. Outside of just the basic assembly of the chassis itself, depending on the model kit you've chosen, at least some custom work will be required to get everything to fit together and look as lifelike as possible. These plastic model kits were obviously not designed to work with an RC chassis, so of course a little custom work will be required. While achieving a lifelike appearance is generally the goal with these projects, another thing that's important to keep in mind is ease of maintenance. RC vehicles are best when they're designed to be easy to repair. However, doing this can become more difficult the more realistic you want the vehicle to appear. RC electronics generally don't bear much resemblance to the components you'll find on actual vehicles, so if possible, it's best to tuck them away out of sight as much as possible. This not only applies to the plastic model to RC conversions you frequently see on this channel, but many 1/10 scale builders do the same with their crawlers, trail trucks, and drift cars. As you can see, the results are impressive, but it does come with some compromise. Now fortunately in general, the more lifelike the vehicle, the less likely it is to have issues, simply because it's not being jumped, raced, or bashed around. Most people don't drive their RC 4-wheel drive Trailfinder 2 the same way they drive their Arrma Kraton, and as a result, shouldn't have as many broken parts. Of course, often the more scale the vehicle, the more careful you have to be when driving. There's not a lot of folks who've invested hundreds, if not thousands of hours into building a super scale lifelike RC model such as this, only to bash it around and go full send off some jumps. The drivetrain and electronics aren't getting stressed out just cruising down the trails, so the chances of needing to replace any of that are pretty low. Although I guess that isn't always the case. If you need evidence of that, check out my prior video featuring an update on this custom Jeep J10. I've designed and 3D printed the entire chassis of this vehicle, and while it certainly looks good, and overall it is working pretty well, it's still a work in progress of course, and I wouldn't exactly consider it reliable at this stage. Despite not doing any crazy driving, it's needed some pretty frequent maintenance and repair, as I'm continuing to refine the design and improve the durability of each component bit by bit, first starting with the drivetrain and now moving more towards the suspension. Now to be fair, this is an extreme and unusual example of course, which most hobbyists are unlikely to ever experience if they're using a more conventional platform that isn't entirely a DIY creation. But from the very start, I knew this chassis was going to be sort of a test bed that was going to need frequent parts changes and maintenance. Because of this, from the very start, I made sure that the chassis would be easy to separate and fully accessible. Just pop the one-piece body off and instantly I have access to the chassis below. Good planning on my part. Now with this GMC General on the other hand, well, ease of maintenance and disassembly was a consideration to a degree, but with the power of hindsight, some things could have certainly been done a bit better. So let's go through the process now and see if I can pass on any wisdom to any of you other CTC01 builders out there. I've been having a lot of fun cruising around this 1/25th scale GMC General ever since I completed it a couple months ago. It was even featured in a recent video where we put together a little RC car chase, cast as one of the antagonists chasing the 68 GT500. A little fun fact with that video is that the truck actually lost steering during the filming process, but thankfully all of the shots were just it driving straight, so steering wasn't really that important. The broken steering servo wasn't actually caused by any of the action featured in that video. Much earlier on when I was still building and testing the CTC01 chassis, I had accidentally dropped it, which caused the steering servo to be damaged but still somewhat work. I figured I'd swap the servo at this stage while it was still just a chassis and was very easy to access. But unfortunately I forgot, so the entire truck got built with this damaged servo still installed. Well, too late for an ounce of prevention, now it's time for the pound of cure. Fortunately, the cab and sleeper are just secured to the chassis with magnets, so as long as the battery is removed, which goes inside the sleeper, it comes off very easily, as do the fuel tanks and battery boxes. Unfortunately, the hood is secured to the bumper, which is glued to the front end, so I thought I'd try just working around it while I remove the entire front axle and suspension as carefully as my limited patience would allow. Now during this process, the glue holding the front bumper on did break, which for a second I thought might be nice so I could get the hood moved out of the way, but of course I instantly realized that these parts were now being held on with nothing more than that tiny magnet wire for the headlights, which I glued to the frame rails during the build process. So I had to proceed carefully as those wires don't look like they'd be very fun to have to solder back together. In an earlier video, I talked about how the steering servo slots into place on the one side and then uses a screw to secure the opposite end. A nice, simple design, admittedly borrowed from FMS, that keeps all of the chassis parts easy to print and securely mounts the servo between the frame rails. As a result of this design though, I do need to separate the frame rails for the servo to slide out. That means removing a couple of screws connecting the front cross member and prying the frame rail far enough for the servo to come out. I did glue the engine and the radiator to both sides of the frame rails, so that didn't exactly make this process as easy as it could have been, but with a little persuasion, it came right out without completely destroying the truck. We can see the shiny new steering servo there on the left. I decided to install it as is and then just paint the sections that are still visible once it's installed. Now you should always test the steering servo before installing it, especially when the servo is as much of a pain to install as this one. This is one of the steering servos we sell though, so I figured I would simply demonstrate my complete confidence by just slapping it in there and getting everything mounted without even bothering to test it first. I got the new servo mounted and plugged into the receiver, which was a little bit of a pain to get the wires routed how I had it before, but it's all good. Of course, I also had to glue the front bumper back into place. Just like when I built the truck the first time, I did my best to ensure that the hood is properly aligned with the rest of the cab. After that, all that was left to do was reinstall the front end, connect the steering linkage, and make sure everything works. After adjusting the position of the servo arm and setting the trim, it's good to go. Honestly, I was more concerned about any of those lights becoming disconnected than I was having the steering servo not working. Really glad those tiny wires held up. And of course, to put the icing on the cake, I touched up the underside with some matte black paint to help that servo blend right in. And there you go, the GMC General is back in action. Hopefully that new steering servo lasts a long time. So what's the lesson here? Well, as easy as it is to simply glue parts like that front bumper into place, using things like screws, magnets, or Velcro will certainly help make the vehicle much easier to take apart and repair. Also, choosing to run those tiny wires for the LEDs inside some small tubing, which could possibly be secured using something like zip ties for easier disassembly, would be a good idea for this truck. That way the hood could be easily separated from the chassis. Just being able to get the hood out of the way would have been a big help. But also ensuring that the engine and radiator aren't glued to more than one piece would be nice, or even be made to be removable. But I think considering how infrequently any sort of maintenance will be on a super scale vehicle like this, it's probably not a big issue. I'm not sure if going through all the trouble to create some custom mounts for these parts would ever really prove to be worth the effort. Sure, the process here might not have been the most convenient, but it obviously wasn't impossible either. But you certainly don't learn anything without doing, so whatever you're working on, keep the tiny wrenches turning and keep finding ways to make things better. The GMC General is back up and running just in time to haul around this new trailer I built for it. Be on the lookout for a new video showcasing that build very soon. But that's all I've got for today's video. As always, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.